Hi there. I'm already getting some private chats from people. Sorry, 27 participants already. Wow.
Okay, so we can start. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah, and I will be your host for today. I would like to thank you for taking part in our first heritage webinar entitled Effective Modeling in Heritage Science. The webinar is based on a special issue of the same name, and if you're interested in contributing to this topic, all the information is available on the webinar's webpage. The webinar will be chaired by Professor Dr. Peter Brimblecom, who will be a speaker together with Dr. Jenny Richards. We will have time for questions from the audience at the end of the webinar, moderated by today's chair. So if you have any questions for our speaker, please post them in a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, or you can raise your virtual hand. And please remember to mention the name of the person to whom you're addressing your question. I would like to remind that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available as soon as possible on the webinar's webpage. And please note that you need to be logged into SciForum in order to view the recordings. The certificates of the webinar will be available on your personal area in SciForum after the webinar. Finally, I would like to present our chair, Professor Dr. Peter Brimblecom. He was born in Australia and went to university in Auckland, completing a PhD in atmospheric chemistry. He researched long-term changes in urban air pollution and effects on health and buildings at the School of Environmental Sciences in the University of East Anglia. In recent years, he started focusing on environmental issues in Asia, working at the City University of Hong Kong and National Sun Yat-sen University in Taiwan. I thank you very much for accepting to chair this webinar. That's it for me. I now hand over the microphone to our chair, and I hope you'll enjoy.
Well, hello everybody. So I'm going to try and share my first slide. So it's really great to have you here, and we have more people than we expected, but that's, I guess, the good news. So, as Sarah has said, what we're going to do in this webinar is to introduce a special issue, effective modeling in heritage science. So, how did this come about, and what are the rules of engagement in this particular webinar? So please raise your hand, the little hand, if you want to speak. Use chat where possible to direct questions, and you can direct them to everybody or to specific people if necessary, so this can be sent to a single person. A few people I know have prepared some material, so if you've prepared material, do send a message in the chat to Jenny or Sarah. So, what were the origins of this particular special issue? Jenny and I were working about a year ago on an article about the transfer of heritage modeling knowledge from research to practice. And writing this particular manuscript was a really gloomy experience, because we found that so many models were created in heritage science that were never really used. So we thought, well, what to do about this? And we then had this idea that perhaps we should have a special issue that promoted the idea of effective models in the heritage sciences. And an effective model we felt was one that was going to be used and one that was going to be further developed. So in terms of the special issue, what did we decide the scope of the special issue should be? So we were thinking mostly of process-based models, models that explored the degradation of material and change to material under environmental sort of pressure. We also wanted this special issue to bridge the gap between research and practice so that models would become used in practice. We were aware, of course, that some contributions might be quite philosophical, some might focus on managing the processes, how does management use models, and so on. But we did seem to feel that things like digital storage, laser mapping, virtual reality, scope of the special issue. So the kind of topics we perceive might be relevant would be models that examined the processes of change. There might be some new or refined models, quantifying deterioration processes, thinking about strategies to minimize deterioration and so on. There'd be models addressing the lifespans of heritage, and sort of essentially these models would be aimed at a kind of improvement in the way that we undertake practice. So they would hopefully have practical applications. And we thought mostly these models will be either quantitative or semi-quantitative. So what are the technical issues related to this particular special issue? Well, manuscripts in this special issue will be due January of next year, so not very many months away. And as you know, MDPI Heritage is an open access journal, so it charges fees. However, up until the 31st of October, the fees are being waived in a kind of celebration of the fact that MDPI Heritage has gained its site score. There will be a small number of further waivers available until the 31st of January. And after that, we may not be able to grant any waivers. And so then there'll be the processing charge for each article, which I think this is the high end. I think it's probably a little less than this. And certainly there are all sorts of discounts possible. So, but try and aim to get your article in as soon as possible. And then there's more chance that we can offer a fee waiver. Submissions will have to use the MDPI Heritage template. There's no page limit or charge for color, although of course you don't want to write massively long manuscripts because they are hard to referee, and of course people tend not to read them if they're massively long. Naturally, the published articles will be open access, and the authors are granted extensive rights to reuse the material that they prepared for the special issue. So those are the technical sides of the special issue. I saw the special issue as a kind of team effort, which is why we're holding this webinar. So people get an opportunity to shape the special issue, get a sense of how content is developing. I want to encourage cohesion within the special issue. So articles within the special issue, for example, cross-site each other. And so very keen to use webinars, emails, online discussion to support this special issue. And of course, as editors, Jenny and I both want to make sure that refereeing standards are very high. So having said that, I have done all I want to say really on the special issue. And I don't know if there are any chats and questions that people have, but please send us a chat if you would like to ask a question on this. So far, I don't see any questions on the chat. Have any hands been raised?
We've got one hand raised. Oh, yeah.
Okay. So, can we allow Eleonora to speak?
I think I made it.
Hi, Eleanor.
Sorry, I think I made a mistake. In the rush of connecting, I think I just click. Sorry, really sorry. I didn't realize. Okay. I'm really sorry, but I'm present. This is a welcome. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Eleanor. Right. Well, if you do have questions about the special issue, we'll give you some links afterwards at the end of this webinar, so you can use those links and should be able to contact Jenny or myself about the possibilities. So what I'd like to do now is to pass to the second part, which is my little presentation on effective heritage models. So again, I'm going to share my screen. And move on to discuss what do we think are effective heritage models. And this comes from a paper that Jenny and I published earlier this year. So when we were thinking about this in heritage science, modeling is often much less common than in fields like agriculture or climate change, or models would be useful, where people would want to grapple with how environmental pressures are causing change to materials, objects, and sites. And so that's always a little bit surprising. And we also have to reflect on the fact that not all models aim at practice. Some models aim to advance theory, yet others are aiming at providing practical solutions. And both make their own contributions, but there are still questions about what does effectiveness mean. So when you look at the field and you ask the question, well, why are models not being used? There seem to be problems in their application. For example, the spatial and temporal scales may be wrong. For example, the model may deal with processes that take place in a minute rather than the thousands of years that might be relevant to heritage. Or then the scale of a model may be just a few centimeters, whereas heritage objects may be so much bigger than that. Another problem that's argued is that heritage is represented by unique objects. How can a model be generalizable when handling unique objects? Another argument is, well, heritage managers make difficult decisions and have great responsibilities. How can they possibly entrust those responsibilities to a model? The other problem, it seemed to be that the theoretical basis of many models leads to them being seen as rather artificial and not having relevance to the day-to-day management of heritage. And there I simply cite this from this book, which talked about the obstacle. The obstacle is one of the mathematical models often seem to be unable to speak across the broader heritage community. And so those are the kind of things that we felt were important to overcome. And what Jenny and I did with this article we were writing was we did a bibliometric analysis, which I know is very popular these days. And we looked at a lot of papers in the heritage field, which had the keywords heritage and model. We filtered them down by journal. We removed articles on photogrammetry or 3D models. And ultimately, we only looked at papers that were cited more than 4 times a year, so the well-cited papers. And in fact, we ended up focusing on only 6 particularly highly cited papers. But to step back a little bit and think about journals, what is a little bit surprising is that the heritage journals are certainly represented in terms of publishing models. So you see over there in the blue, you can see that the Journal of Cultural Heritage, for example, and Journals of Conservation Science, they do contain a lot of the modeling. However, what is more surprising, and certainly was a surprise to Jenny and I, was that the models, the heritage models, were also very strongly represented in multidisciplinary journals, and they're in green. You see that large block of journals there. So the models are actually being widely published, which may be another problem to their ultimate use. And when you look at highly cited models, these were the 6 highly cited models that we examined in some detail, we were pretty disappointed, because what was happening was we noticed that almost all the citations, all the models when they were cited, were being cited in the introduction and not cited in the text of the paper. So the models were just being mentioned, and then the output and the model itself were not being used. The models were not being developed. So these were the highly cited ones. You think they would be used a lot, and it turns out that actually they're only referenced in passing and then almost neglected in the papers that cite them. The other problem with these models were that it was hard to find the practical application of these models in the published literature. Very hard to find publications which deal with the practical application of even these well-cited models. And we got a sense that it may be because it's quite hard to publish practical applications, because it could be argued by referees that they lack intellectual novelty. So in this graph, what we see is that the models ultimately largely seem to be used in research, in promoting further research, rather than being used in practical application. At least that's how they were reflected in the published literature. However, there were some practical applications of models occurring in conference proceedings. And these as one example, there are a couple of examples of models that had wide practical applications. One was the model ECOS-Runsalt. It appeared in a number of conference proceedings, being used in a very applied way. One of the characteristics we think of that means that ECOS-Runsalt is very popular is it has graphical user interfaces and is really rather nicely presented, so that people who are not experts at modeling find it relatively easy to use ECOS-Runsalt. However, we also note that graphical user interfaces are really time-consuming, difficult to set up, difficult to maintain, and of course, it may not gain the kind of academic reward that most people really hope for. So, in conclusion, what we felt was that the remote between developers and users was not an indication that the developers that were able to understand the challenges of using the model, and the users were unable to feed back their experience with the model to the model builders. We did think there was a role in societies like the Institute of Conservation in maybe bridging that gap, bringing the model developers and the users together. Certainly that would be very helpful. And we also wondered if model developers could gain grants to work in institutions to build graphical user interfaces and so on. We did note the difficulty of language, the mathematics, and the problems of publishing, the very practical work, the practical outcomes of using models in practical applications. We continued to return to this notion of scale and generalizability and how the notions of value have gone on. We've certainly found that models, in changing scales in model, it's very difficult, and the model cannot stand alone. The model has to embrace other features, like other information. It can't just work by the model output itself. And I think these are the kind of things that Jenny will touch on in the next talk. So let me escape from that and stop sharing my screen and pass to Jenny.
Thank you, Peter. So I just want to follow on from Peter in some of the work that we've done since looking at this work on effective modelling more broadly. And I will also just share my screen. And so we wanted to investigate the idea of moisture as a driver of as a long-term threat to historic timber. But within this framework of trying to think about effective modelling and what makes an effective model, to try and address some of the issues that we raise in the paper that Peter has just talked about. And we were particularly interested in timber because of the document of the Principles of Conservation of Wood and Built Heritage, which raised the need to recognise the vulnerability of structures made of wholly or partly of wood to varying climatic or environmental conditions. And we think that moisture is one factor that's particularly important to consider. But as you will see there are also many other factors that also need to be taken into consideration. And so to try and understand what are the pressures faced by historic timber, we realised, and again, this was linking back to the idea of scale raised in the previous question, that knowledge and action would both be required at a strategic level and also a local scale. So more broadly to global scale and then down to site-specific scales. And so we use this kind of two-scale framework to try and address this problem. And we quickly realised that this was to address both scales in one bit of research was far too much. And so we've split it into two. And so actually the first paper is being published as part of the special issue and the second has been submitted, but we split it along these two scales. And so firstly, looking at a global or more of a strategic scale approach, we've used one of the global climate models by HADGEM, the HADGEM 3 model, to try and understand how have pressures by moisture changed from the past into the future. And so we wanted to gain more of a sense of what's happened since industrialization, so roughly 1850, through to the end of the 21st century. We also use, when we are projecting into the future, we use a high emission scenario to try and understand what might be a worst case situation. And we also look at what might happen we don't use the standard climate parameters, but instead we've tried to focus on this idea of having heritage climate parameters. So again, this is trying to really tailor the model and what is the model doing to a heritage specific setting. So instead of just using like annual rainfall or these quite common parameters that are used within climatology, we wanted to think and use parameters which are very relevant to deterioration processes within heritage materials and within timber materials. So we've used these 6 parameters, which you can see listed here, which is the annual relative humidity range, seasonality of relative humidity, time of wetness, wind-driven rain, salt transitions, and the Sheffer index. And again, you can find more information on the definitions of these in the paper that's available online, which is an MDPI journal, open access to everyone. And so we use these, and we wanted to see how have these parameters changed from 1850 to the end of the 21st century, to try and understand where might these different heritage climate parameters change, or where might the dominance vary over space. So we used a mapping approach to try and highlight differences or similarities between regions, even if they might not be close to each other geographically, even if they might be disparate, but you can still start to see similarities in different parts of the world. So I'm just presenting one result, which is the first heritage climate parameter, which is the mean range in relative humidity. And if I just play this, you can see it shifting. So I'll play it a couple of times, but we're mapping the 4 time periods and you can see changes. So you can see over time that the range in relative humidity increases, particularly in like Central Asia and into Europe, also in North America and Canada, and it also increases in the tropics and across South America. So you can see that over time there's been quite substantial changes in these parameters, suggesting that the risk from this pressure might increase in these areas. We also wanted to highlight, in terms of ways of presenting model outputs, that we wanted to have it in a way that could be easily interpretable. So we wanted to use global maps where you could see results for heritage located wherever it would be in the world. And we also developed the GIFs, which can be run on Loop, but just unfortunately not in PowerPoint. As a way of presenting change and as a way of showing change over time. And again, we present these, unfortunately, the GIFs in the MDPI paper can't be embedded within the paper, but we present them as supplementary materials. So again, in terms of using different formats of how to present results in order for the outputs and models to be presented in the most effective manner, we also encourage people to think creatively and use supplementary materials to present results in manners that in ways that might not standardly be included in paper formats. And so I just wanted to present one other result from the paper to global scale. And this was looking at the dominance of different pressures across the world. So this was looking at which of the factors, which of the heritage climate parameters pose the greatest threat in different regions. And so we can see here that across most of the world, it's this range, this relative humidity range that has the greatest pressure. But that in areas such as across the tropics, we can see that its time of wetness and the Sheffer index has quite a notable impact, as well as in China and Southeast Asia and Western Europe. And then across Eastern North America, we can also see that salt transitions also plays a notable impact. But as we, again, map this across time, we can see that by the end of the 21st century, that there's notable shifts in dominance, with particularly at the end of the 21st century, the Sheffer index becoming particularly important in the tropical regions. And so again, this highlights the need for potential conservation strategies to be aware of the shifting dominance in risks and how these changes in risks might need to be incorporated into conservation strategies over time. But that these risks are being faced by multiple places around the world. And so again, having building networks or increasing to build networks across these regions might be really useful in terms of developing effective conservation strategies. And so our global scale findings that we have presented is that the traditional parameters used in climate science, we argue that they don't capture effectively the interactions between heritage and climate, and instead argue that the use of heritage climate parameters are far more useful, particularly for development policy. We also show that future climates and future heritage climates will lead to a redistribution of the risks, and so we saw this in the last year. And that lots of this is caused by a projection of a less humid heritage climate. And when we're talking about humidity here, we're talking specifically about relative humidity, not specific humidity. And so we argue that's important for heritage climates. We also argue that global maps are a useful tool for policy making and raising public awareness, and can also provide visually, show opportunities for collaborations, even in non-contiguous regions. But we also are very aware that with these global maps, they're very hard to interpret on a site scale or understand how might that threat at a global scale actually impact down to individual sites, buildings, and objects. And so this was where we then focused on looking at local scale. So we tried to then take this and do this transfer across global to local scales. And in order to do this, we wanted to couple global scale data with local scale data to try and gain this transfer. But what we quickly found out, as I'm sure you're all too well aware, is that local scale data is very imperfect. And so we firstly need to be very judicious in the way that we use this data, but we also needed to be very flexible in the range of sources that we use to create to count towards or use as local scale data. And so we use things like observational records or meteorological records, cultural references, policy documents, heritage reports. And we also wanted to draw on this idea that Mike Hume raised in his book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, which is this idea that narrative is really important in order to convey messages about the future, particularly regarding climate change. And so we wanted to try and almost like test this method of combining modeling and narrative in order to see if it was a useful way of conveying modeling and model outputs to being an effective, having effective outcomes in practice. And so what we did was we focused on a number of case study sites around the world. And what we did was we went coupled, or for each of these case study sites, we tried to find as much local information as possible. And this, as I've already mentioned, meant drawing on a whole range of sources. And we wanted to deliberately remain flexible and open-minded about what we included to try and create a rich understanding of what was happening, where and how, and the processes that were going on. And so you can see the range of sources that we drew upon to try and create these narratives and try to give a richer understanding and context to our model outputs. And so I won't present the results here, and I'm sure you'll be able to read about them soon. But what I did want to just draw upon is instead, which I think is particularly relevant for this webinar, is some of the challenges that we faced for effective models at a local scale. And we came across three main challenges. So firstly was regarding data. So when we use global scale data, it was great that it provided a full coverage of the globe, of everywhere, all terrestrial land, and also we could have mapped it for the sea if needed, but it lacked the local scale resolution for it to be effective at site scales. But then when we went to a local scale, it was very specific for sites, but that it could be very patchy, it could be discontinuous, or it could require us to do some post collection adjustment to make it relevant for the site. Our second challenge that we highlight is this idea of damage, and how do we use models to understand damage. So both in terms of understanding what are the actual conditions, what are the main conditions that drive the damage, are we actually focusing on the main conditions that drive damage, or are we managing to miss important processes far more relevant and important to sites? And we also then found the issue of damage with regards to materials versus sites. So lots of the traditional damage functions focus on historic materials rather than whole sites or objects. And so again, there's a scale issue going on between how do we understand damage occurring to specific materials rather than sites. And finally, we also found challenges for effective models going back to action, and that this can be very challenging due to the unequal distribution of resources, both financial, human resources, and how do we transfer potential knowledge into conservation action. And then finally, with action, we also increasingly became apparent to us the importance of addressing uncertainty. And so uncertainty could occur due to uncertainties in the climate models. So are we effectively capturing the climate systems going forward into the 21st century? Or it could be that we don't understand how the dominance in the risk of pressures is going to change going forwards. Or it could be due to a whole myriad of economic, political, other factors that might also influence heritage and deterioration in that way. So we really highlight these three challenges, again, for effective models going into local scale. So in conclusion, we argue that model projections shouldn't be taken in isolation by themselves, and instead they provide a much richer understanding when they are incorporated with local observations and other contextual information to understand how might multiple threats or uncertainties influence future processes. And we also highlight that to do this, we need to be flexible in considering a whole range of quantitative and qualitative sources. We also argue that evidence-based narratives could really help build trust in modelled outputs and provide a mechanism for broadening engagement with in the climate change impacts on heritage. And finally, we also, again, similar to the global scale, argue that similar threats in geographically disparate regions could promote international collaboration. So I'm going to pass back to Peter, who I think is going to lead the next bit with people who might have already got some pre-prepared things.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jenny. What I would like to do now, I think Ori sent us a presentation on her work on glass, and so I wonder, Sarah, could you allow Orly to talk and to show her material?
Yes, 1 second. Okay. And now she should be able to talk.
So, hello everyone.
Okay.
Do you want that I share my screen?
That would be great. Yes, thank you.
Okay. But I don't see the...
Oh, down in the bottom?
Yeah.
A little green button.
Yes, but... Okay.
Oh, Orly, I think you're on mute.
It's okay. Do you see my screen?
Yes, great.
So I'm Aurélie Vernet-Caron. I'm an assistant professor at the LISA at the University of Paris, Est Créteil, and I am working on the impact of climate and pollution and the alteration of materials. and especially on the alteration of stained glass windows. So I would like to propose a paper on the comparison of two different methodologies to model the alteration of medieval stained glass. So the first methodology is those response functions that were established by Manfred Schreiner in the framework of the ICP materials program where I am involved. And they have measured the alteration thickness for two glasses, M1 and M3, and I selected the M1 glass. And they have exposed these glasses for 6 and 12 months in sheltered and in unsheltered conditions. So they have developed those response function, the first one for the 6 months samples, and we see that it depends on SO2 concentration, quantity of rain, and the pH of rain. And for the 12 months those response function, they also included the relative humidity. And in parallel with my PhD student Lauriel Sessegolo, we have developed some geochemical model by determining kinetic laws with different experiments at the laboratory. So we have developed a law for the dissolution of the glass and for the interdiffusion mechanism, and for two situations, the rainfall events. So this law depends on the pH and the temperature of rain, and in unsaturated medium, it depends on relative humidity and temperature. For the moment, we didn't consider the pollution, except via the pH of the rain. But you see here, it's a very simple model, but we consider the three different situations, the rain events, the situation where the altered layer is soaked by water, and the situation with only relative humidity with water as vapor. So we have these kinetic laws, and we made different assumptions, and I can show you some preliminary results. First we used the idea is to compare these two models, and for that we used a set of data of Manfred Schreiner available in the report 49 of the ICP materials program. And you see we have the temperature, the relative humidity, the SO2 and the NO2 concentration, the quantity of rain, and the pH of the rain. So they have measured the alteration thickness after 6 and 12 months in blue, and they have here you have the calculation of the dose using the dose response function in green, and in the third column this is the alteration thickness calculated using our geochemical model. So you see the results on these graphs, on the left after 6 months, and on the right after 12 months. So we see that the order of magnitude of results are good. We see some significant deviation, for example, for 3 cases, 2 where our model cannot account for the high value because we don't consider the SO2 concentration in the industrial sites, and 1 where our model is better than the dose response function, but and we have similar results after 12 months. So we would like to continue this comparison by the calculation of the secondary phase quantity. And we would like to discuss the perspectives for improvement of this model, and possibly to conduct some extrapolation to assess the climate change impact, for example. So these are very preliminary results, but it was the idea that I could propose for this special issue. Sorry, I thought I had my video, but.
Well, thank you so much, Aurelie. I hope we have a little bit of chance for questions right at the end. Sarah, could we unmute Helen Lloyd now, because I know she was going to talk to us for a few moments.
She should be able to turn on
Helen,
her microphone.
Could you unmute? Great. Hi, Helen.
Hello. So, play from the start. So, by comparison with the last presenter, this is a very basic model, and it was designed with a completely practical application. So, I used to work for the National Trust. I was there for about 39 years. I'm now a freelance consultant. And I developed this model at the Trust to introduce some facts and fairness to decisions about how many collections care staff each historic house should employ, and how large an annual budget was needed for the non-wage costs of preventive and remedial conservation. And this was really in response to a huge change in the way in which the properties were being accessed by the public. So over my time with the Trust, you can see that the number of annual visitors to Trust properties shot up from about 1 million to 26 million. This manifested itself in the properties, instead of being open for sort of 5 days a week for half of the year and having about 20,000 visitors, they were suddenly being overwhelmed by more than 100,000 visitors, sometimes 200,000. And there was pressure for them to be open all year round to kind of accommodate all these people. What happened was that there was really an increasing pressure on need for collections care, and not a kind of recognition that if you have more visitors, you get more dust, you need to actually look after the collections more intensively, and that they were also being exposed to more hours of daylight. And the staff were, what staff there were, had no time to actually do the work in looking after the collection. So we started to think about what a sort of appropriate balance should be, a sustainable balance between staffing levels, numbers of visitors, the amount of input into conservation, and the costs, both the income coming from the visitors, but also the money that needed to be spent on conservation. So I started with a very, very simple thing, which was to take kind of 8 criteria that could define the differences between properties, and to give them each of them a score from 1 being very low to 4 being high. And I was looking at 350 properties with very different collections and very different opening arrangements. So we looked at the significance of the collection its fragility and indeed the fragility of the building it was held in, the complexity, or rather perhaps the diversity of materials that staff needed to look after, the size of the inventory, the size and significance of the library, the number of historic spaces that were accessible, the number of visitors that were coming in, and the number of hours of access that were being offered. So we gave every property a score, we added them up, the maximum total was 36, and we converted that to a percentage, and then we arranged on a spreadsheet all the scores in descending order. And what became very clear quite early on was that the simplicity of the scoring was kind of not realistic, in the sense that many properties had much larger inventories than we realized. The libraries were larger. The number of spaces that staff were looking after were much greater. The number of visitors had grown quite significantly, and the annual hours of opening had changed dramatically. So on this slide, you can see the coloured bands representing the scores 4, 3, 2, 1 going down, but going across are the modified scoring ranges, if you like. And by being more precise about these numbers, we were also able to calculate more accurately the score for each property. So I'll move swiftly on to showing what this looks like. Now, the spreadsheet is large. So I'm going to show it in 3 chunks across the screen so that you can read some of the numbers. So this is the first bit, which is really just addressing the kind of quality and the quantity of material in each house, its fragility, complexity, size, etc. And already this is a very small portfolio of properties in the northwest of England. And you can see very marked differences in the scale of the properties and the scores that they were getting. I mean, even if you just look at the first 3 columns of significance, fragility, and complexity. So this just gave us an idea of those differences between the properties. In all of these screens, the most complex property is at the top and the least complex at the bottom. So we then wanted to think about what this means for the staffing of the properties. So what caliber of staff is needed to lead the house team, and how many support staff do they need? And so we took a sort of banded approach to this. The Trust has 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 grades for its house staff, 6 being the highest and 11 being the lowest for a trainee. And we rather simplistically took the percentage scores on our spreadsheet and said for every 10%, we need a higher grade of staff to look after the collection. So on this screen, you also see that the most complex properties at the top, banded orange, get the highest level of staff and the most support staff. And as you go down the scale of properties, I've tried to use coloured bands to sort of key your eye into how the information relates between one screen and the next. So the blue colours at the bottom are again the smallest properties needing the least level of staffing. So this now is the middle section of the spreadsheet, and it shows how many areas of the property are accessed by the public and need to be cleaned every day, how many visitors are coming into that property, what the total hours of access are over the whole year, and producing the percentage score that then indicates what staffing level is required. And on the right-hand side, you see the grading for the staff at the different properties and the number of different posts. So then, while we were working with Peter on the Leverhulme dust research project and looking at the effects of dust on historic collections and the need for frequency of cleaning or infrequency of cleaning, we refined our cleaning schedules. And Peter came up with this lovely model, which I'm just going to show you quickly, illustration of how staff time is divided between the rooms over the course of a year. So the resources that are allocated to spaces match the size of the room and the density of the collection. And there is cleaning that is done every day, which is only really in the areas that are accessed by visitors and the robust surfaces that they can see from the visitor route. Then, and that we allocate between 20 and 30 minutes per room per day for these spaces. Then on the days when the houses are not open, there's in sequence during the course of the year, each room gets a more intensive clean up to about head height, and that's represented by the purple band in the middle. And then once a year, every room is cleaned from ceiling to floor. So that's everything then gets an intensive clean.
That's brilliant. Could we draw that to a close? You've only got 5 minutes and another speaker. That was all.
Okay.
All
right.
Is that a good point to end?
I can more or less end here, which brilliant. Is just to say that we then were able to allocate either 20 minutes per room per day or 30 minutes per room per day. And the difference there is that if you only allocate 20 minutes, then it assumes that the staff are all present every day of the week. And of course, houses operate 7 days a week. The staff are only paid for 5 days. And so in order to build an allowance in for a kind of rota system, you have to allow 30 minutes per room per day. And this spreadsheet just illustrates how the number of spaces and the amount of time that's needed per day calculate the number of staff that actually need to be employed, part-time staff, to do that work. So I'll finish there and just saying that the paper I've proposed actually goes on to show how this basic data can then be used to with the conservation performance indicator to measure how successfully properties are actually meeting their targets for cleaning and caring for their collections. And it can also be used to rationalize how much money each property should be spending on the care of its collection every year, the non-wage costs related to both preventive and remedial conservation. So that's me. Sorry.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, we've moved completely from theoretical to very, very practical. So I think we've now embraced the full range of the types of models we're talking about. And I'm afraid there won't be much time for questioning because we've got one more speaker. And Sebastian, please go ahead, and I'm pretty sure I know what your model is going to be about, and look forward to hearing it.
Thank you very much. So I'll just share screen. So I hope you can see the screen now and that you can hear me. Yeah, I'm guessing. So the paper that we propose is based on the modeling with Ecos Ronsalt, which Peter already discussed shortly. And these are the co-authors that will be writing with me. Now, the paper is actually almost finished. And why we are writing this is really specifically because Ecos Ronsalt is being used, but it really needs a little bit more of explanation for many people because it is often questioned and misused. Also, we've seen several times. So there's a misunderstanding sometimes in the use cases. So what we're trying to do is really explain more thoroughly what can be done with it, some issues, and we also propose some terminology and methodology. And this is just 4 or 5 slides, and I just want to show you what the paper is about, to find some links then with other papers, and that we can collaborate maybe with some other people who are thinking of writing something. So the paper setup is really just looking at the models in general for built heritage and how they are used also for salt, looking at salt transitions. And we describe some of the theory behind equals run salt. And then we have this terminology, and then we really go into detail about the use and methodology of using run salt, the user interface. And this includes also a shortlisted review. And this is here, we can find maybe some links with other articles that will be published. And then we look at some limitations and some solutions that propose some improvements for future models as well. So the models and theory, we really discuss about these different models that are available. And then we look at the background and theory of equals run salt. And I just want to show you this because we propose a specific terminology. There's something that is missing in lots of papers. There's overlaps of terminology and uses of crystallization and dissolution and so forth. So we propose certain kind of acronyms and specific meanings of them. And this is, if somebody is working in this area, I'm happy to discuss further also if this would be something that others accept as well. Just want to show you this quickly. And then we go forward into giving a more overview of how to interpret the model outputs and some issues with that as well, and how these reactions can be read properly. So we go from every little bit of the specific kind of outputs that we see, look at these reactions, and then we go further with the limitations and certain solutions that we see, and the specific salts that have some issues, for example, calcium nitrates or magnesium sulfates, and also the lack of calcium sulfate in the model and why it's also okay to have that lack. And then we show also some problems with some magnesium sulfates, and we propose also following new data, what should be actually considered when you see these model outputs. And this is just a selection of certain of these things. And that's all actually I just wanted to show. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. That's really great. And I really am grateful for everybody you're trying to get through so much material so very, very quickly. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. So what I will try and do is I will try and, through the webinar, set up a space where people can ask questions, because we didn't really have time to finish all those. And I know a number of other people had some material they would like to talk about. So maybe we'll have to set up an additional seminar. So do apologize for all that. And thank you all so much for attending. And I know some people have to leave, so that would be really great, and we'll keep you informed about the progress of the special issue. If you want to join the special issue, please use the link that Sarah shared earlier, and just great to have you join us. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I also wanted to thank you, Chair and Speaker, for your time and interesting contribution to this webinar. And also thank you to our attendees. I hope you found this webinar interesting. And just a final reminder, the recording of the webinar will be made available as soon as possible on the webinar's webpage. And to access your certificates of attendance, you need to log into your SciForum profile with the same email you used to register to the webinar and go to My Certificates. And that's all. I wish everyone a nice day, evening, or morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining us. Bye-bye.